No one steps into a storm like this, unless they are looking for something they've already lost. The wind tore across the northern cliffs, hurling snow against the ancient stone walls of Thornfield Castle with a relentless fury, each gust clawing at the battlements like a warning that no living soul should be outside. Yet Duke Sebastian Thornfield walked forward into the white abyss with steady, deliberate steps, his dark coat snapping behind him as frost gathered along the edges of his gloves, his breath visible in sharp bursts that vanished almost as quickly as they came, because he had not come to save anyone. Not tonight. Not ever again. He had come to confirm what his guards had reported. A body left beneath the outer wall. Another nameless casualty of a world that devoured the weak and forgot them just as quickly. And yet when he reached the shape half buried in the snow, something about it made him pause. Not the stillness, not the fragile outline of a woman curled against the cold stone, but the way the snow around her had not fully settled, as if the storm itself had hesitated to claim her. He stood there for a moment, silent, unmoving, the storm howling louder around him, urging him to turn back, to leave her to the fate already written into the frozen ground. And perhaps he would have, on any other night, in any other life. But then her chest moved, barely, a shallow rise beneath the thin fabric of her dress, so slight it could have been imagined, except it wasn't. And before he could stop himself, he stepped closer, the crunch of snow beneath his boots, unnaturally loud in the vast emptiness, his shadow falling across her face just as her eyes opened, not wide, not startled, but slow, deliberate, as if waking was an inconvenience she had not chosen, and they met his without fear, without desperation, without even the instinct to beg. There was only a quiet awareness in them, something steady and unervingly calm, as though she had already accepted the cold, the silence, the end, and his presence changed nothing. Sebastian frowned, the unfamiliar sensation of hesitation threading through him as he crouched slightly, his gloved hand hovering just above her shoulder but never quite touching, because something about her stillness made the moment feel wrong. "You're dying," he said at last, his voice low, carried away by the wind almost as soon as it left him, and for a heartbeat, there was no response, only the storm pressing in, the castle looming behind him like a silent witness. And then her lips parted, the faintest trace of breath escaping into the frozen air. "Not yet," she whispered, the words fragile but unmistakably certain. And it was that certainty, more than anything else, that unsettled him, because it did not belong to someone at the edge of death. It belonged to someone who knew something he did not. His jaw tightened, his instincts pulling him in opposite directions, one honed by years of isolation telling him to leave her, to let the storm take what it had already claimed, the other, quieter but more dangerous, urging him to act. And before he could fully decide, his hand moved, brushing against the fabric at her shoulder, cold, too cold, yet undeniably alive. Her fingers twitched at the contact, weakly curling as if reaching for something she refused to name. And in that small, unconscious motion, something shifted, not in her, but in him, a crack in the careful distance he had built around himself. He exhaled slowly, the decision settling into place with a weight he could not ignore, and without another word, he slipped one arm beneath her and lifted her from the snow, her body lighter than it should have been, her head falling slightly against his chest as the storm raged on. And for the first time since stepping beyond the castle walls, Sebastian Thornfield realized he was no longer walking back alone. But as he turned toward the looming gates, her voice came again, softer now, almost lost to the wind. "You shouldn't have found me." And something in the way she said it made the cold feel sharper, deeper, as though the danger waiting inside his own walls had just begun. The castle doors groaned open against the weight of the storm as Sebastian stepped inside, the sudden warmth of the great hall rising to meet them, yet failing to reach the cold that clung to the woman in his arms. Snow melting slowly into darkened patches along the marble floor while the servants froze in place at the sight of their duke carrying a stranger across the threshold, something that had not happened in years, not since the halls had fallen into silence and routine. "Prepare a room in the east wing," he said without breaking stride, his voice low but absolute, cutting through the tension like a blade. And though no one questioned him, their glances followed, uncertain, curious, almost wary of the figure he carried, as if she had brought the storm in with her. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder, her breath shallow but steady, each faint exhale brushing against the fabric of his coat in a rhythm that should have reassured him but did not, because there was something unnatural in her stillness, something too composed for someone pulled from the edge of death. He moved through the corridors lit by flickering candlelight, shadows stretching along the stone walls as if reaching for them, the castle itself seeming to hold its breath at her arrival. When they reached the chamber, the fire had already been lit, its glow soft but insufficient against the lingering chill that followed her. Sebastian lowered her carefully onto the bed, the mattress dipping slightly beneath her weight, her fingers loosening their grip on his coat, but not entirely letting go. As though some part of her refused to release him even in unconsciousness, he hesitated for a brief moment before gently freeing the fabric from her grasp, stepping back just enough to look at her properly for the first time. Her features were pale beneath the remnants of frost, her lashes dark against her skin, her expression calm in a way that did not belong to fear or relief, but something quieter, something deeper. "She needs warmth," the housekeeper said softly from the doorway, breaking the silence. Sebastian nodded once, though his attention did not leave her. "See to it," he replied, his tone distant, as if the words came from somewhere far behind the thoughts that now occupied him. The servants moved quickly, bringing blankets, adjusting the fire, their movements careful and measured, yet none of them spoke directly to her, as though they sensed that whatever had crossed into Thornfield with her was not meant to be disturbed. Sebastian remained where he stood, watching as the color slowly returned to her lips, as the tension in her hands eased just enough to reveal what she had been holding so tightly, a small object, half concealed within her fingers, something metallic that caught the firelight in a brief, subtle glint. His gaze sharpened, recognizing the shape before he fully allowed himself to acknowledge it. It was not something a woman dressed as she was should possess, not something that belonged to chance or coincidence. His jaw tightened slightly, a question forming without answer, just as her fingers curled again, hiding it from view as if even in her weakened state, she understood its value. The room grew quieter as the storm raged outside, the sound of wind pressing against the windows like a reminder that the world beyond these walls had not changed, but inside, something had shifted, something unseen but undeniable. Sebastian turned at last, moving toward the door with measured steps. Yet before he crossed the threshold, a faint movement drew his attention back. Her eyes fluttered open once more, slower this time, heavier, but aware. They found him immediately, as though she had never lost sight of him at all. And in that brief moment, before exhaustion claimed her again, she spoke, her voice barely more than a breath. "They will come," she said, not with fear, but with certainty, and the way the words settled into the silence made the warmth of the fire feel suddenly distant, as if the storm had followed her inside after all. The door closed behind Sebastian with a quiet finality, yet the words she had spoken lingered in the air long after the sound faded, settling into the corners of the chamber like a presence that refused to be ignored. He did not move immediately, his hand resting lightly against the cold wood, as though he could still feel the echo of her voice through it. "They will come," she had said, not as a warning, not as a plea, but as a simple truth, and it was that certainty that unsettled him most, because it did not belong to someone rescued from the edge of death. It belonged to someone who had already seen what lay ahead. He exhaled slowly and turned away, the corridor beyond stretching into shadow and candlelight, each flicker casting long shapes against the stone walls that seemed to shift as he passed. The castle had always been quiet, but tonight the silence felt different, heavier, as though something unseen had taken notice. He descended the grand staircase with measured steps, his thoughts sharpening with each one. The image of the object in her hand returning with unwelcome clarity, that brief glint in the firelight, the unmistakable shape of something rare, something that should not have been clutched by a woman left to die beneath his walls. He reached his study and pushed the door open, the familiar scent of old wood and ash greeting him, yet offering none of the comfort it once had. Crossing the room, he paused before the wide window overlooking the outer grounds. The storm had not lessened, snow still driving across the landscape in relentless waves, erasing all traces of what had been left behind. all except the memory. His reflection stared back at him in the dark glass, sharp, composed, unchanged, and yet beneath it, something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, a fracture in the distance he had maintained for years, a reminder that he had stepped into the storm not just to confirm a death, but to bring something unknown back with him. Behind him, the fire cracked softly, the sound breaking the stillness just enough to pull him back to the present. He moved to his desk, his fingers brushing against the surface as he considered the implications of what he had seen. The castle was not a place where accidents happened, not anymore. Everything that crossed its threshold did so with purpose. And if she had been left beneath those walls, then someone had intended for her to be found or not found at all. Either possibility carried its own danger. A soft knock came at the door, measured and cautious. "Enter," he said without turning. His steward stepped inside, his expression composed, but his eyes betraying a flicker of concern. "Your Grace," the guards report no sign of anyone approaching through the storm. But there were tracks earlier, leading toward the outer wall. Sebastian nodded once, his gaze still fixed on the darkened window. "And now?" he asked. "Gone, Your Grace. The snow has covered everything." Of course it had. The storm had a way of erasing truths before they could be understood, leaving only fragments behind. Sebastian turned slightly, his voice lowering. "Double the watch tonight," he said. "No one enters or leaves without my knowledge." The steward inclined his head, though his hesitation lingered for a brief moment. "Do you believe she was followed?" Sebastian did not answer immediately, his thoughts returning to the quiet certainty in her voice, the absence of fear, the weight behind her words. "I believe," he said at last, each word deliberate, "that she knew exactly where she was when she was left there." The room fell silent again, the firelight flickering across the walls as the storm pressed on outside, and somewhere in the east wing, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the woman he had carried from the snow lay waiting, not for safety, but for whatever was already on its way. Clara Vale did not wake the way most people did. There was no sudden gasp, no confusion, no desperate attempt to grasp where she was or how she had survived. Instead, her eyes opened slowly into the dim glow of candlelight, as though she had expected this exact moment and simply arrived when the time was right. The fire crackled softly nearby, its warmth spreading through the room in quiet waves. Yet she remained still beneath the heavy blankets, her gaze fixed on the ceiling above her, listening, not to the obvious sounds of the storm beyond the walls, but to something deeper, something beneath the silence itself. Her fingers shifted slightly against the fabric at her side, instinctively searching, and when they found the small object still hidden in her grasp, her breathing steadied just enough to reveal the importance she placed on it. She closed her eyes briefly, not in rest, but in calculation, as though measuring time in heartbeats rather than minutes. The door opened. Without warning, the sound deliberate but not loud, and she did not turn her head when Sebastian Thornfield stepped inside, his presence filling the room before his voice ever could. He paused just inside the threshold, studying her with the same quiet intensity he had carried into the storm, taking in the subtle changes, the color returning to her skin, the steadiness of her breath, the awareness in her stillness. She knew he was watching, and yet she did not acknowledge him immediately, allowing the silence to stretch between them until it became something tangible, something that demanded to be broken. "You are awake," he said at last, his voice low, controlled, the words more observation than question. Her lips parted slightly, her voice soft but clear when it came. "I was never truly gone," she replied, and there was no weakness in it, no lingering trace of the fragile state he had found her in. Only a quiet certainty that made the air feel sharper. Sebastian stepped further into the room, the faint sound of his boots against the floor echoing in the stillness. "Most would consider what I found outside these walls as close enough," he said, his gaze never leaving her face. She turned her head then, slowly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that did not belong to someone in her position. "Most would have left me there," she answered, and something unspoken passed between them in that moment, an understanding neither of them chose to name. The fire shifted, casting new shadows along the walls as Sebastian moved closer, stopping just beside the bed, close enough to see the fine details he had missed before, the faint lines of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the storm, the quiet strength in her expression, and beneath it all, something guarded, something deliberately hidden. "Who left you beneath my walls?" he asked, direct, unyielding. Her gaze did not waver, but her fingers tightened slightly around the object she held, a small movement, almost imperceptible, yet impossible for him to ignore. "Someone who knew you would not," she said, her answer simple, yet carrying a weight that settled heavily into the space between them. Sebastian's expression did not change, but his mind sharpened, the pieces shifting into a pattern that was not yet complete. "You speak as though this was arranged," he said. Her eyes flickered then, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition. "Everything is arranged," she replied quietly, her voice lowering just enough to make the words feel like a truth meant only for him. The storm pressed harder against the windows, the wind rising as though in response. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching once more, thicker now, filled with questions that had yet to be asked, and answers that would not come easily. Then, as if remembering something essential, Clara shifted slightly, her hand emerging from beneath the blankets just enough for the firelight to catch the edge of the object she held, a faint glimmer, unmistakable and deliberate. Sebastian's gaze dropped to it instantly, recognition flashing before he could conceal it. And in that single moment, everything changed, because what rested in her hand did not belong to a stranger, did not belong to chance. It belonged to something far older, far more dangerous. And as her fingers closed around it once more, her voice followed, softer now, but no less certain. "You should not have brought me inside," she said. And for the first time since the storm began, Sebastian Thornfield felt the unmistakable sense that the danger he had carried through his own doors was not waiting outside, but standing right before him. The firelight flickered between them, casting shifting shadows across Clara's face as Sebastian's gaze remained fixed on her hand, on the object she had so carefully hidden and revealed in the same breath. The recognition he felt was not immediate, but it was certain, like a memory half-buried that refused to stay forgotten. He stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing until the quiet tension became almost tangible. "Show me," he said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. Clara did not move at first, her eyes studying him with that same unsettling calm, as though she had already considered this moment and decided how it would unfold long before he spoke. "If I do," she replied softly, "you will not be able to pretend you do not understand." The words settled heavily in the room, and for a brief moment, the storm outside seemed to fall into silence, as if even it waited for what would come next. Sebastian's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, a shift from curiosity to something far more deliberate. "I have never relied on pretending," he said, and though his tone remained even, there was an edge beneath it now, something that matched the quiet certainty she carried. Clara held his gaze for a second longer, measuring him, weighing something unseen. Then slowly, deliberately, she opened her hand. The firelight caught the object fully this time, revealing a small, intricately crafted piece of metal, worn but unmistakably refined, its surface etched with a crest that had not been seen beyond the inner circles of power for years. Sebastian's breath stilled, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel the shift within himself, because the crest was not just familiar, it was impossible. It belonged to a lineage thought lost, to a name that had not been spoken within these walls since before he had taken his title. "That is not something one simply finds," he said, his voice quieter now, more controlled, as if each word had to pass through careful restraint before being allowed to exist. Clara closed her fingers around it once more, not in fear, but in protection. "No," she agreed. "It is not." The simplicity of her answer only deepened the weight of what remained unsaid. Sebastian turned slightly, pacing a single step away before stopping again, the movement restrained but necessary, his thoughts aligning into something sharper, more focused. The storm, the abandoned figure beneath his walls, the certainty in her voice. And now this. None of it was coincidence. None of it could be dismissed. "You were not left there by accident," he said, more to confirm than to question. Clara's gaze followed him, steady, unflinching. "No," she said again, the same calm certainty threading through her voice. I was placed there. The word echoed in the silence, deliberate, chosen, and far more dangerous than anything else she could have said. Sebastian turned back to her fully now, his presence filling the room in a way that left no space for doubt. Then you were meant to be found, he said. And this time, it was not a question at all. Clara did not look away, but something shifted in her expression, not fear, not hesitation, but something quieter, something almost like resignation. Yes, she said. And then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch far longer than it should have, she added, but not by you. The words settled between them with a weight that neither of them could ignore, and for the first time since he had carried her through the storm, Sebastian felt the full shape of what he had done, not just an act of defiance against the cold, not just a moment of unexpected mercy, but a choice that had altered something far larger than either of them. The fire cracked softly behind him, the only sound in the room as the storm continued its relentless assault beyond the walls, and in that quiet, suspended moment, one truth became impossible to deny. Whatever had been set into motion the moment he stepped into the snow was no longer his to control. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, as if the very walls of Thornfield were listening, holding their breath alongside the two figures caught within the dim glow of firelight. Sebastian did not speak immediately, his gaze fixed on Clara with a focus that had sharpened into something unyielding, something that no longer questioned whether she belonged here, but demanded to understand why she had been placed within his reach. Then someone miscalculated, he said at last, his voice low, steady, carrying a quiet authority that did not rise in volume, yet filled the entire room. Clara's expression did not change, but her eyes held his with the same unsettling calm. Or perhaps they did not, she replied, and there was no defiance in her tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of something far more complex than either of them had yet uncovered. The fire shifted behind her, its light catching briefly in her eyes, revealing not fear, but awareness, a depth that suggested she had been walking toward. This moment long before the storm had ever begun, Sebastian took another step closer, closing the remaining distance until he stood at the edge of the bed, his presence no longer distant, no longer removed. You expect me to believe you were sent here without purpose, he said, and though the words were measured, there was a tension beneath them now, a thread of something that had not existed before, something closer to challenge than curiosity. Clara's gaze lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the blanket as though grounding herself in something tangible. Purpose does not always reveal itself when it arrives, she said quietly, then lifted her eyes back to his. Sometimes it waits. The words settled between them with a weight that was not easily dismissed, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the storm pressing harder against the windows as if echoing the tension building within the room. Sebastian exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, deliberate, yet carrying the faintest edge of something unresolved. And what is it waiting for? He asked. Clara did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting past him for the briefest second, toward the door, toward the corridor beyond, as if measuring something unseen, something approaching not with sound, but with certainty. For the moment when it can no longer be ignored, she said at last, her voice softer now, but no less certain. The answer was not what he expected, and that alone made it more dangerous. Sebastian turned slightly, his instincts pulling his attention toward the same unseen space she had acknowledged. The castle remained still, the guards alert, the storm unbroken, and yet there was a sense of movement beneath it all, something subtle but undeniable. He stepped back from the bed, his posture straightening as the weight of his roles settled over him once more. You will remain here, he said, the words no longer a suggestion but a command. Clara watched him carefully, the faintest hint of something unreadable crossing her expression. For your safety, he added, though even as he spoke, he knew the words did not fully belong to the situation before him, because safety was no longer a simple matter of walls and firelight. Clara inclined her head slightly, not quite agreement, not quite refusal, but something that existed between the two. And yours? She asked softly, the question catching him off guard in a way nothing else had, because it was not asked with concern, but with quiet observation. as though she already knew the answer. Sebastian held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned toward the door, his hand resting briefly against the handle before he spoke again, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "My safety was decided the moment I stepped into the storm," he said, and with that, he opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, leaving behind the warmth of the fire and the presence that had already begun to alter the very rhythm of Thornfield itself. And as the door closed once more, Clara remained where she was, her fingers tightening slightly around the hidden crest, her eyes fixed on the empty space he had left behind, as if she could already see what was coming through it. The corridor felt colder than it should have as Sebastian Thornfield moved away from the east wing, the warmth of the chamber fading with each step until only the steady echo of his boots remained, measured, controlled, yet carrying a tension that had not been there before. The storm continued its relentless assault against the castle walls, but inside, the silence had shifted, no longer empty, no longer familiar. It pressed in around him with a quiet insistence, as if something unseen had begun to take shape within the very structure of the place he had ruled for years. He paused at the landing overlooking the great hall, his gaze sweeping across the dim expanse below. The torches burned steadily, the shadows stretched long across the stone floor, and the guards remained at their posts, unmoving, alert. Yet even in their discipline, there was a subtle difference, a heightened awareness that had not been present before, as though they too felt the change but could not yet name it. Sebastian's hand rested briefly against the cold railing, his thoughts returning not to the storm, not to the tracks that had already been erased, but to the woman now resting within his walls, her voice, her certainty, the way she had spoken not as someone rescued, but as someone who had arrived exactly where she intended to be. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible for a moment before fading into nothing, and turned toward his study once more, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that did little to contain the thoughts now circling with increasing clarity. He crossed to the desk and opened the drawer with deliberate precision, retrieving an old document, its edges worn, its seal long broken but still bearing the same crest he had seen glinting in her hand, the same mark that had not been acknowledged in years, perhaps decades. He placed it on the desk, his fingers resting lightly against the faded ink as memory surfaced not in fragments, but in sharp, unwelcome clarity. A name that had been removed from conversation, a lineage that had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only questions and a silence that had been easier to accept than to challenge, until now, because now that silence had returned in the form of a woman who did not belong to chance, who did not speak in uncertainty, and who carried with her something that should not have survived. A soft knock broke through his thoughts, sharper this time, more urgent. "Enter," he said without turning. The door opened quickly, his steward stepping inside with a tension that could no longer be concealed. "Your Grace," he began, his voice lower than usual. "There is movement beyond the outer gate." Sebastian's gaze lifted instantly, the shift immediate, precise. "Explain," he said, the single word cutting through the room with quiet authority. "A carriage," the steward replied. "It has stopped just beyond the main approach. The storm has nearly buried it, but it is there, and they are not attempting to enter." Sebastian's expression darkened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because that detail alone confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. This was not an accident, not an unexpected arrival seeking refuge. This was something placed, something waiting. "How many?" he asked. "We cannot see clearly through the snow, but at least 2 figures remain near the carriage," the steward answered. "They have made no move to approach the gates." Of course they had not. They were not here to request entry. They were here to ensure something else, something already inside these walls. Sebastian turned fully now, his presence shifting into something colder, more deliberate, the hesitation from earlier gone, replaced by a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Maintain position," he said, his voice steady. "No one engages unless I give the order." The steward inclined his head, though the unease in his expression remained. "Yes, Your Grace." As he turned to leave, Sebastian added, "And double the watch at the east wing." The command was quiet, but absolute, because whatever had arrived outside the gates was not the beginning. It was a continuation, and as the door closed once more, Sebastian stood alone in the dim light of his study, the storm raging beyond the walls, the crest resting before him, and the undeniable realization settling into place with a weight he could no longer ignore. The moment he had carried her through the snow had not changed the course of events. It had only revealed it. Clara Vale did not close her eyes again after he left, the warmth of the fire settling around her like a fragile illusion that could not quite reach the chill beneath her skin. She remained still beneath the blankets, her gaze fixed on the dim outline of the door, listening not to the obvious sounds of the storm pressing against the castle walls, but to something far more subtle, the quiet shifts within the structure itself, the distant echo of movement along stone corridors, the almost imperceptible change in rhythm that came when a place accustomed to silence began to stir. Her fingers tightened slightly around the crest hidden within her grasp, the cool metal grounding her as her thoughts aligned with a precision that had nothing to do with fear, because fear required uncertainty, and there was none left in her. Not now, not here. The moment she had been waiting for was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Though not entirely as it had been planned, her eyes flickered briefly toward the window, where the storm blurred the world beyond into shifting white, concealing more than it revealed. But she did not need to see what stood outside. She already knew. They had come as expected, but they had not moved, and that detail alone told her everything she needed to understand. They were waiting, not for permission, not for opportunity, but for confirmation, and that confirmation rested within these walls. Within this room, within her own presence, a soft sound. Outside the chamber door drew her attention. Not a knock, not a voice, but the faintest shift of weight, measured, controlled, someone standing guard, closer than before. The Duke had acted quickly, she noted, more quickly than most would have. The thought passed through her mind without judgment, only acknowledgement. He was not a man who ignored patterns once he recognized them, and that made him both an advantage and a complication. Her gaze lowered slightly, her expression unreadable as she considered the narrow line between those two truths. Footsteps approached in the corridor, steady, deliberate, not hurried but purposeful, and though they paused just beyond the door, she knew before the handle turned who stood on the other side. Sebastian Thornfield did not hesitate when he entered this time, the door opening with quiet certainty as he stepped inside, his presence carrying a different weight than before, sharper, more defined, as though the uncertainty that had lingered between them had been replaced by something far more direct. He closed the door behind him without taking his eyes off her, the silence settling once more, but no longer uncertain, no longer searching. This time it felt like the space between two forces that had finally acknowledged each other. "A carriage waits beyond my gates," he said without preamble, his voice low, controlled, the words precise. Clara did not react with surprise, only a faint shift in her gaze that confirmed what he already suspected. "Yes," she said quietly, her tone unchanged. He took a step closer, studying her carefully. "They are not attempting to enter," he continued, watching for any change, any hesitation. There was none. "No," she replied, just as calm, just as certain. The simplicity of her answers did not frustrate him. It sharpened him, because each confirmation narrowed the possibilities into something far more dangerous than speculation. "Then they are waiting," he said, not asking, stating. Clara inclined her head slightly, the faintest acknowledgement of a truth that had already been understood. "They are waiting to see if I remain here," she said, and this time, the weight of her words landed fully, no longer subtle, no longer veiled. Sebastian's expression remained composed, but the air in the room shifted, tightening around them as the implications settled into place. "And if you do not?" he asked. Clara's gaze held his, steady, unflinching. "Then they will leave," she answered, the certainty in her voice leaving no room for doubt. The storm outside surged, wind striking the windows with renewed force, as if punctuating the moment, and for a brief second, the room seemed smaller, the space between them charged with something neither of them could fully define. Sebastian exhaled slowly, his mind already moving ahead, calculating, adjusting. "You were meant to draw them here," he said, and this time, there was no hesitation in the statement. Clara did not deny it, but neither did she fully accept it. "I was meant to be seen," she replied, the distinction subtle, but critical. And as the firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that shifted and stretched along the walls, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever game had been set into motion beyond the castle gates, it no longer existed outside alone. It had crossed the threshold, and it now stood between them, waiting to unfold. The fire burned lower as the storm pressed harder against the windows, its relentless voice threading through the silence that had settled between them. Yet neither Clara nor Sebastian moved, the space between them now defined not by uncertainty, but by a quiet recognition of something far more deliberate unfolding beneath the surface. Sebastian studied her carefully, no longer searching for answers in what she said, but in what she did not. The distinction she had drawn lingered in his mind, not meant to draw them here, but meant to be seen. And that subtle difference shifted everything, because it meant she was not the center of the design. She was the signal, the confirmation of something larger, something that required observation rather than action. Seen by whom? He asked at last, his voice low, controlled, yet carrying a sharper edge than before. Clara's gaze did not waver, but her fingers moved slightly beneath the blankets, brushing once more against the crest as if anchoring herself to a truth she could not yet fully reveal. By those who believe they understand what has been lost, she said quietly, and though the words were carefully chosen, they carried a weight that reached far beyond their simplicity. Sebastian's expression darkened slightly, not with anger, but with realization, because there were few who still concerned themselves with what had been lost, fewer still who would act upon it, and none who would do so without purpose. He took another step closer, his presence now unmistakably imposing, not out of force, but out of certainty. And do they understand? He asked. Clara's lips curved just enough to suggest something between acknowledgement and quiet defiance. No, she replied, her voice steady. They believe they do. The firelight flickered between them, casting shifting shadows across her face as the storm surged once more, and in that moment, the air in the room seemed to tighten, as though the truth she carried pressed outward against the boundaries of what could be spoken. Sebastian turned slightly, his thoughts aligning with a clarity that had replaced all hesitation. Then they will not remain patient forever, he said, not as a question, but as a calculated expectation. Clara inclined her head faintly. No, she agreed. They will not. The certainty in her tone matched his own, and for a brief moment, they stood in perfect understanding of the situation without needing further explanation. Outside the gates, figures waited not for permission, but for confirmation, and inside these walls, that confirmation had already been given, whether intended or not. Sebastian exhaled slowly, the decision forming not from impulse, but from the steady logic that had guided him through far more predictable conflicts. Then we control what they see, he said, his voice lower now, deliberate, the weight of command settling into each word. Clara's gaze sharpened slightly at that, the first true shift in her expression since he had entered the room, not surprise, but recognition, as if she had been waiting to see whether he would arrive at that conclusion on his own. You intend to remain visible, she said, not questioning, but confirming. Sebastian met her gaze directly. I intend to ensure that whatever they believe they have found does not become what they expect, he replied, and though his words were measured, there was an unmistakable edge beneath them now, something that hinted at a strategy still forming, but already set in motion. Clara studied him for a moment longer, the silence stretching once more, but this time it carried something new, something closer to alignment than opposition. That will change the outcome, she said quietly, not warning, not advising, but stating a fact. Sebastian's expression remained steady, unshaken. It already has, he answered, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it was true. The moment he had stepped into the storm, the moment he had chosen to lift her from the snow, the course had shifted, not in small ways, but in ways that would ripple outward beyond the castle walls, beyond the waiting figures in the storm, beyond whatever design had been set into motion long before either of them had stood in this room. The fire cracked softly behind them, the only sound that did not belong to the storm, and as Clara's fingers tightened once more around the hidden crest, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever had been meant to be seen had already been revealed, and now, It was no longer a question of whether the game had begun, but who would control how it was played. The decision settled between them with a quiet finality that neither the storm nor the silence could disrupt, and for the first time since she had been brought inside, Clara shifted not as someone recovering, but as someone preparing, her movements slow but deliberate as she pushed herself slightly upright against the pillows, the firelight catching in her hair and along the edge of her expression, revealing not fragility, but control. Sebastian did not stop her, did not move to assist, because something in the way she carried herself made it clear she did not need help, not in the way others might. He remained where he stood, watching, measuring, his presence steady, unyielding. "If you remain visible," she said quietly, her voice more grounded now, less distant, "they will not wait much longer." Sebastian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth without hesitation. "Then they will come to the gates," he replied, his tone even. Clara's gaze sharpened faintly. "No," she said, the single word cutting through the assumption with quiet precision. "They will come closer than that." The distinction settled into the space between them, altering the shape of what he had already begun to anticipate. Sebastian's expression did not change, but his thoughts adjusted instantly, the pattern refining, the strategy narrowing. "They believe you are still outside," he said. Clara nodded once. "They must believe that," she answered, and now the weight of her role became undeniable, not bait, not victim, but something far more deliberate, something placed at the edge of visibility, meant to draw attention without revealing truth. The storm surged again, wind pressing hard against the windows, rattling them just enough to echo through the chamber, and for a moment, the sound seemed to underline the urgency building beneath their calm exchange. Sebastian turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the window as though he could see beyond the stone and snow, beyond the distance that separated them from those waiting figures. "Then we give them what they expect," he said, his voice lower now, deliberate, each word placed with care. Clara watched him closely, the faintest trace of something unreadable passing through her expression, not doubt, not agreement, but recognition. "You intend to return me to the storm," she said, not as accusation, but as understanding. Sebastian met her gaze. Again, unflinching, only long enough for them to see what they came for. He replied, and though the plan carried risk, it did not carry hesitation. Clara considered him for a moment, her silence stretching just long enough to suggest calculation. Then her fingers tightened once more around the crest, grounding herself in something deeper than circumstance. "That will bring them closer," she said softly. Sebastian nodded once. "That is the intention," he answered. The fire crackled behind them, the warmth now feeling less like comfort and more like contrast to what awaited beyond the walls. Clara drew a slow breath, not of fear, but of preparation, the kind that came from knowing exactly what must be done, even when the outcome remained uncertain. "And when they do?" she asked, her eyes holding his with a steady intensity. Sebastian's gaze did not waver, his answer immediate, precise. "Then we see who they truly are," he said, and in that moment, the balance between them shifted once more, no longer a question of whether she had been brought here by design, but how that design would unfold now that it had encountered something it had not accounted for. The storm outside roared louder, as if responding to the decision made within these walls, and as Clara slowly pushed the blankets aside, her feet touching the cold floor for the first time since she had been carried inside, one truth became undeniable. The safety of Thornfield had never truly been its walls. It had been the illusion of control within them, and that illusion had just been willingly stepped beyond. The cold reached her immediately, rising from the stone floor through her bare feet as Clara Vale stood fully for the first time since the storm had nearly claimed her. Yet she did not falter, did not reach for support. The weakness that had once defined her presence now replaced by something far steadier, far more intentional. Sebastian Thornfield watched without interruption, his gaze following every movement with a precision that missed nothing. Not the way she balanced her weight, not the quiet control in her breath, not the absence of hesitation where it should have lingered. "You should not be standing," he said at last, his voice low, not as a command, but as an observation grounded in reason. Clara did not look at him immediately, her attention drawn instead to the window where the storm continued its relentless assault, the glass trembling faintly beneath the force of the wind. "And yet I am," she replied softly. The simplicity of the words carrying a quiet defiance that did not need to rise in volume to be understood. Sebastian stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing. Once more, his presence steady, unwavering. "This will not work if you cannot endure it," he said, and though his tone remained even, there was a shift beneath it, something closer to concern than he would have allowed himself to acknowledge. Clara turned then, meeting his gaze directly, her expression composed, her eyes clear despite everything she had endured. "It will work because it must," she said, and there was no doubt in her voice. No room for argument, only a certainty that stood firm. Against the storm itself, the fire behind her cast long shadows across the room, stretching toward the door as if anticipating the path she would soon take. Sebastian studied her for a moment longer, then inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, but in acceptance of a truth he could not change. "Then we do not delay," he said, the words final, deliberate. Clara nodded once, a single motion that carried more weight than any extended exchange. Her fingers closed once more around the crest, hidden within her palm, the metal cold against her skin, grounding, constant, a reminder of everything that had led her here. The door opened before either of them moved toward it, the guard outside stepping back immediately, his presence respectful but alert, the corridor beyond dimly lit, the flicker of torches casting uneven light along the stone walls, the air colder here, thinner, as though the castle itself recognized what was about to unfold. Sebastian stepped forward first, his movements controlled, precise. Clara followed without hesitation, her pace measured, her posture steady despite the lingering effects of the cold that still clung to her. They moved through the corridor in silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly, the only interruption to the quiet tension that seemed to settle over every surface, every shadow, every breath. As they approached the main passage leading toward the outer gates, the storm grew louder, the wind pressing harder, the distant rumble of it filling the space ahead like a warning that had already been given and ignored. Sebastian slowed only once, just before the final archway that led to the entrance hall, turning slightly toward her, his gaze steady. "Once we step beyond this point," he said, his voice low, deliberate, "there will be no uncertainty in what they see." Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her answer immediate, unwavering. "There has never been uncertainty," she said, and in that moment, the final distance between intention and action disappeared entirely. Sebastian held her gaze for a second longer, then turned forward again, leading the way as the great doors loomed ahead, the storm pressing against them. With relentless force, the guards already in position, waiting, watching, the weight of the moment settling into place as the doors began to open, and as the cold air rushed in, sharp and unyielding. One truth became undeniable. Whatever had been set into motion could no longer be contained within these walls. It was stepping outward now, into the storm, into the waiting unknown, exactly as it had always been meant to. The doors opened fully, and the storm rushed in like a living force, cold air cutting through the hall and wrapping instantly around Clara as she stepped forward beside Sebastian Thornfield, the warmth of the castle vanishing behind her as if it had never existed. The snow stretched endlessly beyond the gates, a white expanse broken only by the faint outline of the carriage waiting in the distance, half buried, unmoving, and yet unmistakably present. Clara did not hesitate as her feet met the frozen ground, the cold biting sharply through her. But she did not falter, did not slow, her gaze fixed ahead as though she could already see the figures watching from within the storm. Sebastian remained at her side, his presence steady, his pace controlled, the weight of his authority extending outward even into the chaos of the wind. The guards stood back, silent, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was no longer a matter of protection. It was a deliberate act, a choice that had already passed the point of reversal. The distance between the castle and the carriage felt longer than it should have, each step measured, each breath visible in the freezing air. The storm howled around them, obscuring details, distorting shapes, yet Clara, walked as though the path had already been drawn before her, as though she had walked it once before in another time, another life. When they were halfway across the open ground, the figures near the carriage became clearer, two silhouettes standing still against the storm, watching, waiting, just as she had said they would. They did not move toward her, did not call out, their stillness more telling than any action. Sebastian slowed slightly, his gaze narrowing as he assessed the distance, the positioning, the intent behind their restraint. "They see you," he said quietly, his voice nearly lost to the wind, but carried just enough to reach her. Clara did not turn, did not acknowledge the statement, because she already knew. She had felt their attention the moment she stepped beyond the doors, the moment the storm revealed her presence. And yet she continued forward, each step deliberate, until she stopped just within their clear line of sight, the space between them charged with something unspoken, something held tightly beneath the surface. The figures remained where they were, their outlines steady despite the wind, their purpose unmistakable. They had come for confirmation, and now they had it. A long moment passed, stretched thin by the tension that filled it, until one of the figures shifted slightly, not forward, not closer, but just enough to acknowledge what had been seen, what had been understood. Clara's hand tightened around the crest hidden within her palm, the metal cold, grounding, constant. And for the first time since she had stepped into the storm, she spoke, her voice soft but carrying through the wind with a clarity that did not belong to the elements. "You have what you came for," she said, not as a challenge, not as a question, but as a simple truth. The storm surged around them, as if responding to the words, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the world itself held its breath, waiting for the response that would define what came next. The figures did not answer, not with words, not with movement, but something shifted in the air between them, something subtle but undeniable, a decision made, a conclusion reached, and then, just as quietly as they had appeared, they turned away, their forms fading back into the storm. The carriage left behind, abandoned once more, its purpose fulfilled. Clara did not move, did not follow. She stood still as the wind pressed against her, her breath steady, her gaze fixed on the place where they had disappeared, as though confirming for herself that the moment had truly passed. Beside her, Sebastian remained silent, his presence unwavering, but his understanding deeper now, sharper, because what had just occurred was not an ending. It was a signal sent and received, a confirmation that something far larger had just shifted beyond the boundaries of sight. The storm continued, unrelenting, yet the space they had occupied felt different now, altered in a way that could not be undone. And as Clara finally turned slightly, her voice quieter now, meant only for him. "It has begun," she said, and in the stillness that followed, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever had been set into motion was no longer waiting to be revealed. It was already unfolding. The storm did not lessen as they turned back toward the castle, but something within it had changed, not in sound, not in force, but in meaning, because what had once been concealment now felt like aftermath, as if the wind no longer carried questions, only the echo of answers already given. Clara Vale walked beside Sebastian Thornfield with the same steady pace, though the cold pressed harder now, seeping deeper. Her strength measured not in comfort, but in resolve. She did not look back toward the place where the figures had vanished, because there was nothing left to see there. Whatever had been required of her had been fulfilled in that single moment of presence, of recognition, and now the consequence of it followed, unseen but certain. The castle doors opened once more as they approached, the guards stepping aside without a word, their silence heavier now, more aware, as though they understood that something had passed beyond explanation. The warmth of the great hall returned in a sudden wave, but it did not reach the same way it had before. It did not restore what the storm had taken, because what had changed was not physical. It was something far more difficult to name. Sebastian did not stop as they crossed the threshold, his movements precise, controlled, yet carrying a weight that had deepened with each step taken outside. Clara followed, her presence no longer that of someone rescued, but of someone who had stepped fully into a place she had not come to escape, but to face. The doors closed behind them with a low, final sound, cutting off the storm, but not its impact. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It held something within it now, something that had not been there before. Sebastian slowed only once, just enough to turn slightly toward her, his gaze steady, no longer questioning, but measuring something that had already proven itself. They left without resistance, he said, his voice low. Clara met his gaze, her expression unchanged. They were never meant to stay, she replied. And though her words were quiet, they carried a certainty that left no room for doubt. Sebastian studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once. The smallest acknowledgement of a truth that no longer needed to be tested. They moved again, the corridor ahead stretching into shadow and light, the castle returning to its rhythm, but not to its previous state, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would not return to what it had been. Clara's steps slowed slightly as they reached the entrance to the east wing, not from weakness, but from thought, her fingers loosening just enough around the crest to feel its weight, its presence, its purpose. She turned it once in her hand before closing her fingers around it again, as if confirming that it remained exactly where it needed to be. Sebastian noticed the movement, his gaze following it briefly before returning to her face. You knew they would leave, he said, not as a question. Clara inclined her head faintly. I knew they would understand, she answered, and the distinction, once again, carried more weight than the words themselves. Sebastian's expression remained composed, but something behind it had shifted, not doubt, not uncertainty, but recognition, because understanding implied more than observation. It implied alignment. It implied that whatever had been set into motion had reached a point where its direction could no longer be mistaken. The firelight from the chamber ahead flickered softly, casting a familiar glow that now felt different, altered by everything that had passed beyond the walls. Clara paused at the threshold, her gaze lingering on the space within as if seeing it not as refuge, but as the next point in something already unfolding. This is where it changes, she said quietly, not looking at him. Sebastian stepped beside her, his presence steady, unwavering. It already has, he replied, and though his voice remained calm, there was no denying the truth within it, because the moment he had stepped into the storm, the moment he had chosen to carry her through the gates, the course had shifted in ways neither of them could fully control. Clara finally stepped forward into the room, the firelight catching her once more, but this time, it did not soften her presence, it sharpened it, revealing not someone who had been saved, but someone who had arrived. And as the door closed behind them once again, sealing them within the quiet of the castle, one truth settled into place with quiet certainty. Some destinies are not found in safety. They are revealed the moment two paths cross in the dark, and neither can turn away.